What if your thoughts were never fully yours to begin with? What if the decisions you defend so strongly were quietly shaped long before you made them? And what if control no longer looks like force, but feels like choice? Sigmund Freud believed that the human mind is not ruled by logic. It is ruled by the unconscious, by hidden desires, by buried fears, by patterns formed in silence. This documentary explores 8 psychological signs that reveal when your mind is being manipulated without your awareness. Not through commands, not through threats, but through emotional influence so subtle that it feels natural. Manipulation does not announce itself. It blends in. It adapts. And when it succeeds, the victim does not feel controlled. They feel convinced. Freud described the mind as an iceberg. The conscious mind is only the surface. Below it lies the unconscious, where impulses operate freely, memories repeat themselves, and emotions drive behavior without permission. Manipulation does not target logic. It targets emotion, and emotion lives below awareness. The first sign often begins quietly. You start feeling guilty without knowing exactly why. This guilt does not come from wrongdoing. It appears even when you have done nothing wrong. It arrives suddenly, and it demands correction. Freud believed guilt is created by the superego, the internal authority formed from parents, teachers, and early power figures. This internal voice punishes the ego when it believes expectations have been violated. Manipulators activate this voice intentionally. They express disappointment instead of anger. They withdraw instead of confront. They create emotional tension without explanation. Your mind reacts automatically. You try to fix the feeling. You apologize. You explain yourself. You adjust your behavior. Not because you were wrong, but because guilt demanded relief. Over time, this guilt becomes familiar. You feel it when you rest. You feel it when you say no. You feel it when you choose yourself. The mind learns that peace comes from compliance. This is how manipulation enters softly. The second sign follows closely behind. You begin to doubt your own perception. Freud believed the ego survives by testing reality. When reality is questioned repeatedly, the ego weakens. Manipulation often starts with subtle contradictions. That's not what happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. At first you resist. Then you hesitate. Then you begin to reconsider. You replay conversations in your head. You analyze tone. You question intent. Eventually, you stop trusting your instincts. Reality becomes unstable. Truth becomes flexible. And once you doubt your perception, you become dependent on someone else's version of events. This is psychological control. The third sign appears gradually. You begin seeking approval before making decisions. Freud connected this behavior to unresolved childhood dependency. The child seeks safety through authority. The adult repeats this pattern unconsciously. Manipulators position themselves as evaluators. They do not give direct orders. They give reactions. They approve selectively. They criticize subtly. They reward obedience with acceptance. Before acting, you imagine their response. Before choosing, you anticipate judgment. Your inner authority weakens. External validation replaces it. Freedom disappears quietly. The fourth sign involves emotional leverage. Your emotions begin guiding your actions more than your values. Freud understood that emotion overrides logic instantly. Fear, shame, and affection bypass reasoning and move directly into behavior. Manipulators create emotional consequences. Affection is given when you comply. Distance appears when you resist. You adjust your behavior not because you agree, but because you fear loss. Fear of abandonment is primal. It activates survival instincts. The mind chooses connection over truth. Control deepens. The fifth sign is responsibility. You begin feeling responsible for other people's emotions. Freud believed excessive responsibility forms when boundaries were unsafe in early life. Manipulators exploit this by shifting emotional weight onto you. They feel upset, and you feel guilty. They react strongly, and you feel obligated to fix it. Your needs move to the background. Their emotions become priority. Your life turns into emotional management. This is not empathy. This is emotional manipulation. The sixth sign is constant explanation. You explain your choices. You explain your silence. You explain your boundaries. Freud believed explanation is a defense mechanism used by the ego under threat. Healthy minds state, threatened minds justify. When explanation becomes habitual, it signals insecurity created externally. You are no longer expressing yourself. You are defending your right to exist. The seventh sign is exhaustion. After interactions, you feel drained, mentally, emotionally. Freud believed psychic energy is limited. Manipulation consumes it. You monitor reactions. You choose words carefully. You regulate emotions constantly. Your body recognizes manipulation before your mind accepts it. Fatigue becomes a warning signal. The eighth and final sign is fear of boundaries. The idea of saying no creates anxiety. The thought of disappointing someone feels dangerous. Freud linked this fear to early rejection trauma. Manipulators connect boundaries with punishment, withdrawal, anger, coldness, so you comply, not because you want to, but because fear decides for you. This is the deepest level of subconscious control. Manipulation works because it does not feel like control. It feels like care, like concern, like guidance. Freud warned that the unconscious does not analyze intention. It responds to emotional patterns. That is why intelligence does not protect against manipulation. Emotion bypasses intelligence. Awareness begins when patterns are seen. When you observe guilt instead of obeying it. When you question doubt instead of accepting it. When you pause instead of reacting, control weakens. The mind begins reclaiming itself. This is not rebellion. It is psychological awakening. And once the unconscious is illuminated, the same manipulation no longer works. Once awareness begins, the mind does not change instantly. It resists. Because manipulation often feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. Freud believed the unconscious clings to what it knows, even when it causes pain. The mind prefers predictable discomfort over uncertain freedom. That is why many people stay in psychologically manipulative environments long after recognizing them. Not because they are weak, but because the unconscious fears loss more than harm. Manipulation creates emotional dependency. The manipulator becomes a reference point, a source of approval, a source of emotional direction. When this reference point is threatened, anxiety rises. You feel unsettled, restless, confused. This confusion is not accidental. It is the residue of control. Freud described this state as inner conflict between the ego and the superego. The ego wants freedom. The superego demands compliance. This internal tension drains energy. And when energy is low, resistance weakens. This is why manipulation often intensifies during moments of vulnerability, stress, loss, loneliness, uncertainty. The unconscious seeks safety. Manipulation offers structure. Even harmful structure feels better than chaos. This is how control deepens without force. As manipulation continues, identity slowly shifts. You begin adjusting who you are to avoid emotional consequences. You become quieter, more cautious, more agreeable. Freud believed identity is not fixed. It adapts to relational dynamics. When approval is conditional, identity becomes conditional. You stop expressing spontaneous thoughts. You filter emotions. You suppress reactions. Not consciously, automatically. The unconscious learns what is rewarded and what is punished. This is behavioral conditioning at the psychological level. Over time, you forget the original version of yourself. Not suddenly, gradually, you remember how you used to think, how you used to speak, how you used to feel. But those memories feel distant. You tell yourself you have matured, that you have changed, that this is growth. But growth does not shrink the self. Manipulation does. Freud warned that repression is one of the mind's strongest defenses. Repressed thoughts do not disappear, they hide. They surface later as anxiety, as irritability, as emptiness. This is why manipulated minds often feel restless without knowing why. The unconscious is signaling conflict. Another consequence appears in decision-making. Choices feel heavier. Simple decisions feel exhausting. You overthink. You delay. You seek reassurance. Freud believed indecision arises when the ego fears punishment from the superego. Every choice feels risky, because every choice might lead to emotional withdrawal or disapproval, so the mind hesitates. This hesitation is mistaken for thoughtfulness, but it is fear. Fear disguised as caution. As this pattern continues, trust erodes, not trust in others. Trust in yourself. You second-guess intuition. You doubt emotions, you question desires. The inner voice grows quieter. External voices grow louder. Freud believed autonomy depends on a strong ego. Manipulation weakens the ego by replacing inner authority with external approval. Without realizing it, you begin outsourcing your sense of right and wrong. This is why manipulated individuals often defend the people who control them, not because they agree, but because admitting manipulation threatens psychological stability. The mind protects what it depends on. This defense is called rationalization. Freud described rationalization as the ego's attempt to justify discomfort rather than confront it. You explain away behavior. You minimize harm. You blame yourself. This keeps the system intact. Breaking free begins with discomfort. Awareness alone is not enough. The unconscious must relearn safety. This takes time. When you begin setting boundaries, anxiety appears. Guilt intensifies. Fear rises. This is not regression. It is withdrawal. The mind is adjusting to a new reality. Freud believed anxiety often signals growth. It appears when old defenses no longer work. When you stop explaining yourself, anxiety rises. When you stop seeking approval, anxiety rises. When you choose silence, anxiety rises. But with repetition, the anxiety fades. The unconscious learns that boundaries do not lead to abandonment, that independence does not equal danger. Gradually, internal authority returns. Decisions feel lighter. Thoughts feel clearer. Emotions stabilize. This is ego strengthening. You begin responding instead of reacting. Manipulation loses power when reactions disappear, because manipulation feeds on emotion. Without emotional response, it has nothing to work with. Freud believed insight transforms unconscious patterns into conscious choice. Once a pattern is conscious, it can be changed. But change requires consistency. The unconscious learns through repetition, not intention. Each time you resist guilt, each time you trust your perception, each time you choose yourself without explanation, the mind rewires. Freedom does not arrive suddenly, it builds quietly. One calm decision at a time. As the mind regains autonomy, relationships change. Some people adjust. They respect boundaries. They adapt. Others resist. They push harder. They escalate emotional pressure. This reaction reveals truth. Manipulation becomes visible when it stops working. This is often the most difficult phase. Letting go of familiar control feels like loss. Freud believed loss activates grief, even when what is lost was harmful. You grieve the illusion of safety, the illusion of approval, the illusion of control. But beyond grief lies clarity. You begin noticing peace. Silence no longer feels empty. It feels grounded. Your body relaxes. Your mind slows. This is psychological regulation. The nervous system resets. You sleep better. You breathe deeper. You think clearer. The unconscious no longer braces for emotional consequences. Energy returns. This energy fuels creativity, curiosity, desire. The self reemerges. Not louder, not aggressive, but whole. Freud believed the goal of psychological health is not happiness, it is integration. When thoughts, emotions, and actions align, manipulation loses access, because there is nothing hidden to exploit. This is why awareness is the greatest defense, not awareness of others, awareness of self. When you know your emotional patterns, they cannot be used against you. When you recognize guilt, it loses authority. When you observe fear, it loses control. The mind becomes sovereign. Control ends where self-knowledge begins. And the unconscious, once illuminated, no longer operates in the dark. As self-knowledge grows, something subtle changes inside the mind. You stop feeling the urge to defend your reality. You stop explaining your emotions. You stop negotiating your worth. Freud believed that when the ego becomes stronger, it no longer seeks constant validation from the outside world. It stands on its own. This is when manipulation truly begins to fail. Because manipulation depends on reaction, on emotional leakage, on unconscious permission. Without reaction, influence collapses. People who once controlled the emotional atmosphere around you begin to feel unsettled. They sense the shift. They may not understand it, but they feel it. Their words no longer land the same way. Their silence no longer pressures you. Their approval no longer defines you. This often leads to escalation. Manipulation becomes more obvious when subtle methods stop working. Freud described this as the return of repressed control. When influence is threatened, it reveals itself. You may notice sharper guilt attempts, stronger emotional reactions, more dramatic behavior. This is not coincidence, it is exposure. The unconscious structure that once held power is collapsing. At this stage, many people feel tempted to return to old patterns, not because they want to be controlled, but because tension feels uncomfortable. The unconscious mistakes calm compliance for peace. Freud warned that growth often feels like instability at first, because the mind is reorganizing itself. What once felt normal now feels wrong. What once felt wrong now feels necessary. This reversal is unsettling, but it is also proof of change. As you move through this phase, something important happens. You begin trusting your internal signals again. Your emotions feel clearer. Your reactions make sense. Your intuition returns. Freud believed intuition is the unconscious communicating with consciousness. When manipulation clouds the unconscious, intuition disappears. When clarity returns, intuition strengthens. You no longer ask, "Am I overreacting?" You ask, "Why does this feel wrong?" That question is power, because it shifts focus from self-doubt to observation. Observation creates distance. Distance creates choice. This is where psychological freedom begins. Your decisions no longer feel rushed. You pause. You reflect. You respond intentionally. The nervous system calms. The body no longer braces for emotional punishment. Freud emphasized the body as a carrier of unconscious truth. When manipulation fades, the body relaxes. Muscles loosen. Breathing deepens. Sleep improves. These are not coincidences. They are signs of internal safety. As safety increases, identity stabilizes. You no longer adapt your personality to survive interactions. You show up consistently, not aggressively, not defensively, simply honestly. This consistency is unsettling to manipulators because it removes unpredictability. They cannot provoke. They cannot confuse. They cannot control. Silence replaces explanation. Boundaries replace guilt. This does not make you cold. It makes you clear. Freud believed clarity is threatening to systems built on confusion. When confusion disappears, control has nowhere to hide. At this stage, many people experience grief, not for the manipulator, but for lost time. They realize how much energy was spent managing emotions, how many decisions were influenced, how many versions of themselves were suppressed. This grief is natural. Freud believed mourning is necessary for psychological healing. The mind must acknowledge loss to move forward. But grief does not mean regret. It means awareness. You cannot reclaim the past, but you can reclaim the present. As awareness deepens, relationships reorganize. Some become healthier. Communication becomes simpler. Conflict becomes manageable. Others dissolve. Not through drama, but through distance. This is not punishment. It is alignment. Freud believed psychological health requires congruence between inner truth and outer life. When the two match, peace emerges. Peace does not feel exciting at first. It feels quiet, almost unfamiliar, because chaos once felt normal. But over time, peace becomes grounding. Your mind feels less crowded. Your thoughts slow down. You are not constantly anticipating reactions. Mental space returns. This space allows creativity, reflection, desire. You begin asking different questions. Not how do I avoid conflict, but what do I actually want? Not how will this be received, but is this true to me? These questions mark the end of manipulation, because manipulation cannot survive self-direction. Freud believed freedom is not the absence of influence. It is awareness of influence. Once you see the mechanisms, they lose their power. Guilt becomes information, not command. Fear becomes a signal, not a rule. Approval becomes optional, not necessary. The unconscious no longer operates blindly. It becomes integrated. This integration is the goal of psychological growth, not perfection. Not happiness, but alignment. When thoughts, emotions, and actions align, the mind becomes resilient. Manipulation loses access, because there is nothing hidden to exploit, nothing repressed to trigger, nothing unresolved to control. This is why self-knowledge is the strongest defense, not knowledge of others, knowledge of self. When you understand your emotional patterns, no one can weaponize them. When you recognize guilt, you choose whether to act on it. When you feel fear, you question its source. When doubt appears, you observe it instead of obeying it. The mind becomes sovereign. Freud believed that true freedom begins when unconscious forces are brought into consciousness. Because what is seen can be questioned, and what is questioned can be changed. Manipulation survives in darkness. It dissolves in awareness. And once awareness is established, the same control will never work on you again. As the mind stabilizes, something else begins to shift. You stop reacting immediately to emotional triggers. There is a pause now, a space between stimulus and response. Freud believed this pause is the sign of a strengthened ego. It means the unconscious impulse no longer controls behavior instantly. Before, emotions decided for you. Now, awareness participates. This pause feels small, but it is revolutionary. Because in that pause, manipulation loses timing, and timing is everything. Manipulation works when reactions are fast, when guilt is immediate, when fear moves faster than thought. Once reaction slows, influence weakens. You begin noticing patterns that once felt invisible. The same phrases repeated. The same emotional triggers used again and again. The same outcomes produced. Freud believed repetition reveals unconscious intent. Nothing repeats without purpose in the psyche. What once felt personal now feels patterned, and patterns can be studied. When patterns are studied, they lose emotional authority. You stop personalizing behavior. You stop internalizing blame. You stop absorbing emotional projections. This is psychological separation, not detachment, clarity. You realize that many emotional reactions were never yours to carry. This realization lifts weight. Your mind feels quieter, less reactive, less defensive. You begin responding from choice instead of fear. This is when autonomy becomes real. As autonomy grows, language changes. You stop over-explaining. You stop softening truth. You stop apologizing for existing. Freud believed language reflects internal power structures. When language becomes direct, the ego has strengthened. You say less, but your words carry more weight. Silence becomes comfortable, not awkward. Not tense, grounded. Manipulators rely on noise, on emotional clutter, on confusion. Silence removes all of it. In silence, control cannot hide. As this continues, the body follows the mind. Tension leaves the shoulders, breathing deepens. Sleep improves. Freud emphasized the connection between psyche and soma. When the mind is controlled, the body tightens. When the mind is free, the body relaxes. This is why peace feels physical. Your nervous system no longer expects emotional punishment. It no longer stays alert. Safety returns internally. And internal safety changes how the world feels. You are less afraid of disagreement, less afraid of disappointment, less afraid of rejection. Because your worth is no longer negotiated. It is assumed. This assumption changes everything. People sense it. They respond differently. Some respect it immediately, some resist it, some leave. Each reaction confirms alignment. Freud believed psychological growth always reorganizes relationships. Not everyone can access the new version of you. And that is necessary, because manipulation requires access. Without access, control ends. At this stage, many people feel something unexpected. Gratitude, not for manipulation, but for awareness. They see how deeply human the mind is, how easily emotion overrides logic, how vulnerable everyone is to influence. This understanding creates compassion, not naive compassion. Informed compassion. You no longer judge yourself harshly for past compliance. You understand it. You were not weak. You were conditioned. Freud believed insight dissolves shame, because shame survives on misunderstanding. When you understand the mechanism, shame disappears. This is liberation. As the unconscious integrates, confidence becomes quiet. Not loud, not performative, stable. You trust your inner signals. You trust your decisions. You trust your boundaries. This trust does not require validation. And without the need for validation, manipulation has no leverage. This is the final transformation. You move through the world differently, not guarded, not defensive, present. And presence is power, because presence cannot be rushed, cannot be pressured, cannot be controlled. Freud believed the highest form of psychological health is self-awareness without fear. When awareness no longer creates anxiety, the mind is free. You still feel emotions, but they no longer command you. You still care, but you no longer sacrifice yourself. You still connect, but you do not disappear. This balance is autonomy, and autonomy is the end of manipulation. The 8 signs no longer control you. They become signals. Information, guidance. Guilt informs but does not rule. Doubt invites reflection but not submission. Fear warns but does not decide. The unconscious and conscious work together now. This integration is strength. Freud believed that when the unconscious is made conscious, it loses its compulsive power. And once that power is gone, the mind belongs to itself again. At this stage, the mind no longer feels like a battlefield. It feels like a space you can stand in without tension. Freud believed that psychological suffering begins when the ego is constantly under threat. When it must defend, justify, and adapt endlessly. Once manipulation fades, the ego no longer needs armor. It no longer anticipates attack. It no longer scans for emotional danger. This creates a deep sense of internal quiet, not emptiness. Stillness is often misunderstood. People mistake it for passivity. But psychologically, stillness is strength without urgency. You no longer rush to respond. You no longer rush to explain. You no longer rush to please. time slows. And when time slows, awareness expands. You begin noticing how often people try to influence one another unconsciously, through tone, through silence, through emotional reactions. Freud believed most social interaction is driven by unconscious motives. Very little is truly neutral. But awareness changes participation. You can observe influence without absorbing it. You can witness emotional pressure without responding to it. This does not make you detached, it makes you sovereign. Sovereignty of the mind does not mean isolation, it means choice. You choose when to engage. You choose when to withdraw. You choose when to speak. You choose when to remain silent. This choice is freedom. As freedom becomes familiar, the need to control others disappears. Manipulation and control are rooted in fear. Fear of loss. Fear of insignificance. Fear of being powerless. Freud believed that those who manipulate often do so unconsciously, driven by unresolved insecurity. Understanding this does not excuse behavior, but it prevents you from internalizing it. You stop taking manipulation personally. You stop seeing it as a reflection of your worth. It becomes information. And information is manageable. At this level of awareness, boundaries become natural. You do not rehearse them. You do not justify them. You simply live them. People feel them instinctively. Boundaries no longer need enforcement. They are embedded in presence. Freud emphasized that the strongest psychological boundaries are unspoken. They exist in posture, tone, and energy. When the ego is secure, it does not announce itself. This security reshapes daily life. Simple interactions feel lighter. Conversations feel clearer. Decisions feel easier. Mental energy returns. You are no longer spending it managing reactions, anticipating conflict, or soothing guilt. That energy becomes available for growth. Curiosity returns. Creativity returns. Desire returns. Freud believed repression blocks creativity. When repression lifts, life force flows again. You begin imagining futures without fear. You plan without overthinking. You act without apology. Not recklessly, but confidently. Confidence here is not arrogance. It is alignment. Alignment between what you feel, what you think, and what you do. This alignment makes manipulation impossible. Because manipulation relies on internal conflict, undivided motives, unemotional gaps. When there is no gap, nothing can enter. This is why self-knowledge is not just insight. It is protection. You know your emotional triggers. You recognize guilt patterns. You understand your fear responses. And because you understand them, you are no longer ruled by them. Freud believed that awareness transforms compulsion into choice. You may still feel guilt, but you choose whether to act on it. You may still feel fear, but you choose whether to obey it. You may still feel doubt, but you choose whether to surrender to it. This choice is autonomy. Autonomy does not eliminate emotion. It contextualizes it. Emotion becomes a signal, not a command. As this integration deepens, identity solidifies. You stop defining yourself through reaction. You stop shaping yourself through expectation. You become consistent, not rigid, stable. Consistency builds trust, not only with others, but with yourself. Self-trust is the foundation of psychological resilience. Freud believed that without self-trust, the mind seeks authority elsewhere. When self-trust returns, external authority loses influence. This is the final undoing of manipulation. Not confrontation, not rebellion, internal authority. You no longer need to prove your independence, you simply live it. At this point, the 8 signs that once controlled you transform into awareness tools. Guilt alerts you to values, not obligation. Doubt invites reflection, not paralysis. Approval becomes preference, not necessity. Emotions inform, not command. Responsibility becomes choice, not burden. Explanation becomes optional, not reflex. Exhaustion becomes feedback, not norm. Boundaries become natural, not frightening. This transformation is not dramatic. It is quiet. But it is permanent. Freud believed that once unconscious patterns are integrated, they cannot return in the same form. Because the mind remembers. It remembers what awareness feels like. And once you experience psychological autonomy, you cannot unsee it. Control loses its illusion. Manipulation loses its mystery. The mind belongs to itself again. At the end of this psychological journey, something becomes clear. Manipulation was never about intelligence. It was never about weakness. It was about the unconscious. Freud believed that the greatest forces shaping human behavior operate below awareness. They do not ask for permission. They do not announce themselves. They simply act. That is why manipulation feels invisible. Because it speaks the language of emotion, not logic. The 8 signs were never meant to accuse. They were meant to reveal. Guilt without cause, doubt in your own perception. The need for approval, emotional leverage, false responsibility. Constant explanation. Mental exhaustion. Fear of boundaries. Each sign was a message from the unconscious. Not telling you that you are broken, but telling you that something is influencing you. Freud believed symptoms are not the problem. They are signals. And signals exist to be understood. When you recognize these signs, you do something powerful. You shift from reaction to observation. Observation changes everything. Because what is observed is no longer automatic. And what is no longer automatic can be changed. This is the moment manipulation begins to lose its grip. Not through confrontation, not through anger, but through awareness. Awareness does not fight control. It outgrows it. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop seeking permission. You stop fearing rejection, not because the world becomes safer, but because your inner world becomes stable. Freud believed true freedom is not external. It is internal. It is the ability to feel emotion without being ruled by it, to experience fear without obeying it, to notice guilt without surrendering to it. This is psychological maturity. When the unconscious and conscious work together, the mind becomes whole. And a whole mind cannot be controlled in the same way. Manipulation relies on fragmentation, on confusion, on unresolved fear. Clarity dissolves all 3. You do not need to dominate others. You do not need to prove strength. You do not need to convince anyone. You simply become present. Presence is calm. Presence is grounded. Presence is unmovable. And presence is the one thing manipulation cannot penetrate. Freud once suggested that the goal of psychoanalysis was to turn unconscious suffering into conscious understanding. Because understanding heals, and understanding frees. When you understand how your mind works, you reclaim authorship of your life. Your thoughts return to you. Your choices return to you. Your identity returns to you. And once the mind belongs to itself again, no one can quietly take it away.